recording. Cool. All right, so we're gonna get started here. My name is Jeremy Hayes. I am the director of the Housing Rights and Resources Center at Tenfold. Thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to join us for this discussion with Leah Rothstein. If throughout the discussion, if you guys have any questions, we're going to save them to the end. But as Leah is discussing her book, if you have any questions that come up, put them in the Q&A box, and we will address those at the end. With us today is Leah Rothstein, the co-author of Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. It is the sequel to Color of Law, so it's okay if you missing any plot points, get a little lost, just read the prequel to catch up. And this book describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She writes a regular column to which you all can subscribe to for free at justaction.substack.com. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She led research on reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities, counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development, affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community and labor organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. So with that, I will pass it off to Ms. Rothstein. Take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. So as you might have guessed, I'm going to be spending the next 40-ish minutes talking about racial segregation, how we came to be a racially segregated country, and then what we can do about it now to challenge that segregation. And as Jeremy said, there will be time for questions at the end, so I'll try to leave enough time to get to several of those, but I'll just dive into it. So I'm going to start by talking about this idea of de facto segregation. It's the concept, the explanation we have accepted as a country to explain why our communities are racially segregated. Communities all over the country, in all parts of the country, in all regions, are segregated, particularly the segregation of African Americans and whites is persistent and consistent all over the country. And we tell ourselves that it is a sort of naturally occurring phenomenon. It's not something that happened by law or public policy, but it happened by accident or by naturally occurring sort of self-sorting into neighborhoods where people look like us, ourselves, because we like to live around people who look like us. And so we self-sort into same race neighborhoods. Or we tell ourselves that the segregation of our neighborhoods is due to private actors, private factors, like maybe bigoted landlords or realtors or mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent or give mortgages to African Americans in white neighborhoods. You know, all of these sort of private or accidental occurrences, not government policy. And we look around and we think, you know, it's too bad we're so segregated as a country, but anything that happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We have no obligation to do something about it, or a responsibility or any agency to do anything about it. You know, the Supreme Court agrees with this decision. This is how with this idea, this is how prevalent this concept of de facto segregation is. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in several opinions that because the federal government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in challenging or undoing it. Well, in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, he wrote the book, The Color of Law. And the premise of that book was to debunk this de facto segregation idea. And he called it an utter myth. He said, sure, there were private actors, those landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers who had a role to play in creating segregation. But what they did, their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by government at all levels through explicit government policy, local, state, federal policy that required that we create segregated communities. Now, these policies of the government of all levels were unconstitutional. They're a violation of the Fifth and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And as such, we have an obligation to do something about it. When we reckon with our government violating its own constitution, breaking its own laws, we have an obligation to remedy the harms created through those actions. But so far, nobody has, or we as a country haven't stepped up to our obligation to remedy segregation on a national level. And I'll give one example from The Color of Law. And obviously that book is full of many, many detailed examples of all of the roles and the actions the government took to create and maintain segregation. This is one of the more powerful policies of the federal government that created segregation all over the country. This started or happened around the mid 20th century after World War II. Millions of war veterans came home from the war. They started families. There was a baby boom. Those growing families were met with a housing shortage. There weren't many houses built during the war. And prior to that, in the Great Depression, there weren't houses built. So these growing families all over the country were met with a housing shortage. The federal government wanted to step in to do something to meet that demand for housing, and did this by creating suburbs all over the country where they didn't already exist. So at the time, we weren't a suburban economy like we are today. Most people worked either in factories or in businesses that supported those factories and manufacturing companies, which had to be located in urban areas near rail lines and ports. People had to live near where they worked because we didn't have the same highway system or transportation system we have today. Those factories employed people of all races. So people of all races lived in urban areas and fairly integrated communities in urban centers. Well, in the mid-20th century, when the federal government wanted to meet this demand for housing, decided to suburbanize the country. And it did so by creating and subsidizing suburban developments on the condition that the houses in those new suburban developments could only be sold to whites. So I'll give an example. You might be familiar with Levittown outside of New York City. William Levitt was the developer of Levittown. He decided he wanted to build 17,000 homes for the growing families in New York City. 17,000 homes in a place that was rural at the time. On Long Island, didn't have a lot of people living there. He didn't have the money to finance 17,000 homes. He couldn't get a bank loan to create his small town, Levittown, because it seemed speculative. Banks didn't want to lend him that money because nobody lived there. It seemed sort of crazy. So the only way he could get the funds he needed to create Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee provided by the federal government through the Federal Housing Administration. And the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, would only give Levitt this subsidy. And, same happened with builders like Levitt all over the country on the condition that he only sold his homes to whites. And he had to go even further and put what are called restrictive covenants on the deeds of the homes he built. This is language on the deeds of the home saying that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So this was written government policy. It was written in the FHA manual that this had to be required of developers that the federal government was subsidizing. It was also written in the manual that the federal government wouldn't help create suburbs that were located even anywhere near where African Americans lived because, and I quote, it said this in the manual, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. This was not a hidden policy at the time. It was very explicit. It was very well known. We've just sort of since forgotten about how explicitly our government created racial segregation. So just from this one example, the written government policy that ensured that as suburbs were created all over the country, they were created on a segregated basis, that enough can show us that this de facto segregation idea is nonsense. It was government policy that created segregation. And that those government policies have long-term impacts. So the homes in Levittown and suburbs like it all over the country were affordable when they were first created. They cost about $100,000 in today's money. That's an affordable home price for a working family. Veterans who were white could get a loan from the Veterans Administration with no down payment. Other white homebuyers could get FHA-backed mortgages with low down payment requirements. So these homes, they were subsidized on the development end and on the home buyer end through the federal government. And those white families, they got into affordable homes. Now, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. I don't know any suburban community where the homes sell for $100,000. Today, they sell for 3, 4, 5, 600,000. In Levittown, the median home price is over $600,000. In some suburban communities, they're over $1 million or more. So the whites who were subsidized to buy into homes when they were affordable, what happened over those years, they gained a lot of wealth as those homes accumulated in value. Now, they didn't buy those homes, expecting to get rich, but that's what happened. They, accumulated all of this wealth as their homes appreciated in value. They could then use that wealth to send their kids to college, to weather health emergencies or bouts of unemployment. And most importantly, they could use that wealth to pass it on to their kids and grandkids to buy their own homes, to put down payments on their own homes. African Americans explicitly prohibited from government policy from participating in this wealth generation, the same way that whites were subsidized to do so. So the result is that we have a wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this country that is staggering. There's an income gap between Blacks and whites that is concerning in and of itself, and requires a different sort of set of policy solutions to address. So different topic for a different day. But the average African American household income is about 60% of average white household income. Now that is concerning, but you would think that the wealth gap would be about the same. Two families that make about the same amount of money could save about the same amount of money. But the wealth gap, average African American household wealth is 5% of average white household wealth. That huge disparity is due primarily to the government policies in place that helped whites build wealth through home ownership and explicitly prohibited African Americans from doing the same. So here we are in April. It's Fair Housing Month. We're celebrating the 56th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It prohibits the future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, which is extremely important. You can no longer say to African Americans wanting to buy a home in Levittown, for example, that they can't. So there's no discrimination in the sale of those homes. But that is only a forward-looking policy, and it does not look to the past to address the wealth disparity that exists because of those past government policies that makes it, almost unfeasible for African American families to be able to afford homes in Levittown because they don't have that intergenerational wealth to be able to pay for the down payment. That's why Levittown today, 2% African American, in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. And again, that disparity exists because of the policies in place when Levittown was created. So just because we've sort of changed future-looking policies without addressing the past, these disparities continue to grow and continue to persist. So the wealth gap is one of those ongoing disparities and impacts of segregation. But, the segregation of our neighborhoods is to blame. It underlies many of our most serious social problems and biggest racial inequities in this country. One more example is, because of the segregation of our neighborhoods. And when I talk about segregation, I'm sure you understand that I'm not talking about the benign separation of people where some people live here and some people live here and all else is equal. The same policies that created segregation ensured that the communities where whites were subsidized to live were areas that had access to opportunity and jobs and clean air and well-resourced public schools. We call those areas high opportunity neighborhoods. Those very same policies ensured that the communities where African Americans were limited to living in were deprived of those same resources, less access to healthy air, to well-resourced public schools, to banks, to grocery stores selling fresh food, to open space, et cetera. So those neighborhoods not only lacked those, that opportunity, but also were placed closer to industry, the factories that spew pollution in the air, closer to highways where diesel trucks drive by, more pollution in the ground, in the dirt, more lead in the dirt and in the paint of the older homes where the children live. All of those cause ongoing health problems. So children who grow up in segregated African American communities have higher rates of asthma. They grow up to have higher cardiovascular disease rates than whites, higher cancer rates than whites, and shorter life expectancies. So we're talking about a serious issue that has serious consequences on the quality of our lives and on, in fact, how long we live. So not only do we have an obligation to do something to remedy segregation because of how it was created on an unconstitutional basis, but we also have a responsibility to do something about it if we want to create a country, a society where everybody has access to healthy, long lives. So what do we do? How do we live up to that obligation and that responsibility? Well, The Color of Law came out several years ago. Many people read it. This de facto segregation myth has somewhat less currency in this country. We talk more often about, redlining and all of these policies that created segregation and how unconstitutional they were, and what the ongoing consequences are of those actions. Once we do that, we can start to see that we have an obligation to do something about it. Doesn't mean we know what to do, though. And so that's why my dad and I teamed up to write Just Action, because I think there's a lot of people who want to do something about segregation in our own communities, but don't know how to get started, don't know what there is to do. And so what we found in researching this book is that there's actually so much that we can do to challenge and remedy segregation, that it's not about sort of a lack of ideas or a lack of opportunity to make change. It's just sort of a lack of organization and will and movement that is needed to make those kinds of changes. So we hope that our book, Just Action, helps to inspire some of that in communities around the country. So I'll describe some examples from Just Action about of actions we can take in our own communities to redress segregation and remedy its ongoing harms. And I'll just say that I know many of you, I think, on this call work in housing as your profession. And so I just want to sort of set this up to say that there's a lot that you can do to challenge segregation professionally. And there's also a lot, maybe more, that you can do in your other role, which is as a member of your community, as a resident of your neighborhood. And in order to enact the kinds of changes we see are necessary to challenge segregation, we really all need to be active members of our communities, using our voices to advocate for change on the local level to enact these kinds of changes. So it involves what we do at our desks at our jobs, and also what we do in our communities and with our neighbors at home. So what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to this obligation to remedy segregation, we need a newly reactivated civil rights movement, a movement that's made up of local groups all around the country, educated about how we came to be segregated and ready to take action to challenge it. Now, it might seem like we're on our way towards reactivating the civil rights movement, or it seemed that way for a minute a few years ago. When there's a racial reckoning in 2020, and 20 million people came out in Black Lives Matter demonstrations to demonstrate for racial equity and racial justice. More people than ever before, more white people, certainly, than ever before, who had marched in racial justice demonstrations in this country's history. And then many of those, it felt like something was going to change, felt like the tide was shifting around these issues. But then many of those people, those 20 million people, they went home, they put up lawn signs on their front lawns, they maybe started book clubs, maybe they went back to their companies and issued letters to their shareholders denouncing racism and promising to do better. These are all important steps. They build awareness, they continue the conversation about racial equity, but alone they don't actually change the systems, the structures, the causes, or the consequences of segregation. And so we think one reason for that is because many of those 20 million people didn't know what to do. There wasn't sort of a movement forming for them to join to begin to take on this issue. So how do we start that movement? Well, we argue that we need to start with groups that are focused on local change, taking on local policies, because we understand that while federal policy change, massive federal interventions, massive investments on the federal level, they'll be necessary eventually to challenge segregation nationally. But we also understand we don't have the political will on the national level to make those kinds of changes right now. but we can build that political will locally in our own communities. And there's actually a lot that we can do locally, because even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once it's established, to a large extent, it's local policies and programs that maintain that segregation. So there's a lot that we can change, enact, implement locally that will go a long way towards challenging segregation in our own communities. And then those local efforts can bubble up to federal change eventually. So to build these groups in our own communities ready to take on local policies and issues, we need to start by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups, committees, coalitions in our own communities ready to take on this issue. Now, we understand that that in and of itself might seem daunting. Because we live in such racially segregated neighborhoods, we tend to, not have natural social contact with people of other races outside of the workplace. Going about our daily business in our own neighborhoods, we tend to see people who look like us. But in order to build this movement that we envision and believe is necessary, we need to start to bridge those divides and have, create relationships across races that we can then use to advocate for change together. And so in Just Action, we give some examples of communities that have done that, taken some intentional steps to bring people from segregated parts of the same city together to just start to get to know each other, learn that, we're not all that different. We maybe live in neighborhoods that are very different, but we are similar types of people. We have similar hopes and dreams and aspirations. Start to build those social relationships and connections, and then use those connections to advocate for change together. Now, often groups like this, they get started when a homeowner in a community starts to learn about the history of how they came to be segregated, their neighborhood, by discovering a racially restrictive covenant on the deed of their own homes. So remember, I talked about those racially restrictive covenants that the federal government required Levitt and other builders to put on the homes that they built, said the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So those covenants, they're no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deed of the home forever. They're like part of the legal documentation of the home. And so we researched this and wrote about some homeowners, one in Modesto, California, Rochester, New York, Charlottesville, Virginia, where they discovered these restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes and were shocked. They were shocked to see how intentionally their own community and their own home was segregated. They then went on to research how prevalent the restrictive covenants were in their communities. They've created inventories, maps, where the covenants exist, and overlay them with conditions in different neighborhoods. They, still track to the segregated patterns of our cities. They've created educational campaigns and use that information to raise awareness and inspire action amongst their neighbors. It's there's some communities that are taking that information and trying to pass laws or ordinances to erase the restrictive covenants from the deeds of homes. Now, I understand the desire to do that. It's offensive to see that language on the deeds of our own homes, but I think there's a risk in erasing that history, because it's really important to see in black and white how this happened, how we came to be segregated. Once we can see that it was intentional actions that created segregation, we can start to see that intentional actions can challenge that segregation and do something about it. Without that evidence, without seeing in, black and white on the deeds of our own homes how the segregation happened, we can, go on believing that it was an accident and we have no role to play in doing anything about it. So some communities, rather than erasing that history, are passing ordinances where you can put a repudiation of that restrictive covenant stapled on top of the covenant in the deed of your home. So that's one way of addressing both desires to repudiate that history, but also keep the record of it so we can learn from it and be inspired and motivated to do something about it. So then in Just Action, we describe dozens of strategies and intentional actions that local groups can take on to redress segregation. And they do two things. Like the Fair Housing Act, they look to the future to ensure we don't continue to create and perpetuate segregation. They also look to the past. We have to right the wrongs of the past and address the ongoing consequences and disparities that exist because of segregation if we're truly going to challenge segregation and create more equity in our housing markets. And then the strategies, they fall into a few major categories. The first category are those strategies and policies concerned with increasing investments and resources in lower income segregated African American neighborhoods where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government sponsored segregation. So like I said before, the same policies that created that segregation ensured those communities didn't have the same access to opportunity as white communities. So as a remedy to that segregation, that impact, we want to create higher opportunity, more access to opportunity in those communities to make those segregated African American communities high opportunity areas. Now, we also understand that when investments increase in a lower income community, often what happens, I can't hear anybody's answer, but I hope you're saying gentrification. Because often when we increase investments or resources in a lower income community, people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living there. They move in, they drive up the housing costs. The longtime residents of those areas are priced out of their community just when it starts to be, when it starts to see increased investment in resources. So we want to couple these strategies to increase resources with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when gentrification happens. We can do that in a number of ways, all again, locally adopted ordinances or policies. Rent regulation to protect renters from rapidly increasing rents is one thing we could do. Passing just cause eviction ordinances to ensure that tenants are only evicted if there's a just cause. So landlords can't sort of come up with an excuse, a reason, an unjust reason to evict tenants to get higher paying tenants in. We can also pass inclusionary zoning policies. These are policies passed on the local level that require that when new housing is built, which often happens in a gentrifying community, that a certain percentage of the units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices. This is one way of ensuring that a community that's seeing an increase in investment and rising housing costs, that as that investment increase and new housing is built, that some of it is affordable. And we would go a step further and say that those affordable units should then have priorities or preferences placed on them to ensure that the longtime residents of those communities have access to those new units that are built. Another example of a strategy that can do all of this, prevent some displacement in this community, in gentrifying communities, is providing a right to counsel program. So often in gentrifying communities, landlords will find any excuse to evict tenants. Like I mentioned, that's why we need a just cause eviction ordinance in place. But even in places without a just cause eviction ordinance, lower income tenants who aren't protected by rent regulation, they might fall behind on rent, they might face an eviction for unjust reasons, or they might withhold their rent as a protest against a landlord who refuses to keep up on maintenance in their unit. They're then served an eviction ordinance. And often, when you're served an eviction ordinance as a lower income tenant, you might not show up for your eviction proceedings at the courthouse because you don't know what you can do to defend yourself. You don't believe that there's much recourse in showing up. And it's often true. Landlords usually show up to these hearings. They sometimes come with representation, legal representation. Judges usually rubber stamp those eviction ordinances. Tenants have little recourse to challenge those eviction ordinances. Well, some communities are adopting what are called right to counsel programs that provide free legal representation to lower income tenants who are facing evictions. We wrote about Cleveland in our book, In Just Action. Cleveland was one of the first cities to adopt a right to counsel program. They adopted theirs in 2019. Theirs is city funded, and it's a partnership between the United Way and the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. So the city helps pay for the attorneys. The United Way helps reach the tenants who are faced with an eviction and help make sure that they know that they have a right to an attorney, and then refer them to an attorney at the Legal Aid Society. Now there's over 17 cities. Philadelphia is one. I don't believe there are any others in Pennsylvania right now. And 4 states that have adopted this right to counsel kind of program. Many other cities should be following their lead, especially as the housing affordability crisis just grows and the eviction crisis is also has been growing for a while. One way to help avoid all of those evictions is to provide a right to counsel program. It can be funded by the city government or philanthropic organizations. And then often, it goes a long way towards stopping the evictions. Those attorneys can help the tenants access funds that they're eligible for, benefits they're eligible for, to help get true on their rents if they're behind on rent, and help them avoid getting an eviction on their record at all, which is hugely beneficial for renters to not have an eviction on their rental history. In Cleveland, in the first year of their program, 90% of those who had legal representation, 90% of those tenants had their eviction orders revoked. So again, very important for these families to not have the eviction order on their records. And they could only do that with the help of those attorneys. So this is something we could advocate for locally in our own cities and counties, to adopt a right to counsel program, or advocate for a statewide program. And then once a program exists, help make sure that tenants know about their rights and know how to access that legal representation when they need it. So that's one example of a strategy to prevent displacement in gentrifying communities. The other sort of category of strategies we talk about are strategies that are concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white, usually suburban neighborhoods to diverse residents. There's a lot of ways we could do that. Zoning changes, for one, subsidies, rental payment subsidies, or down payment assistance subsidies to assist families who've historically been excluded from those areas to live there. Inclusionary zoning, again, is another important strategy for suburban communities also. And ensuring that as we're building housing to meet the current, housing crisis, that we're building housing not only in lower income communities, but also in these higher income suburban communities. And when we build housing in those communities, making sure that we're building a full range of affordability types. Not only market rate housing, not only market rate and subsidized low income housing, but also middle income housing, because majority of African Americans make too much to fall into the low income category to be eligible for subsidized low income housing, but too little to afford market rate housing. So they fall in this missing middle category. And as we're building housing to meet the current demand, we have to ensure that we're building this missing middle housing to ensure that all families have access to live in these neighborhoods. So I talked about zoning changes. That's an important first step towards opening up these suburban communities to more diverse residents. Single family only zoning is the law of the land in most suburban communities. All of the residential land is zoned to only allow one house per lot. And in most residentially zoned areas in the country, 75% of residentially zoned areas is zoned only to allow one house per lot. Now, because of single family zoning, we're in the housing crisis we're in today, because that, by only allowing one home per lot, we've capped the amount of housing we can build as a country. And so as demand goes up, the housing supply hasn't been able to keep up. And so housing prices have just risen. Now, what you might not know is that single family only zoning came to prominence in the early 1900s, mid-early 1900s, when cities were told by the Supreme Court that they could no longer use racialized zoning. So cities used to zone their residential areas by race, saying this is a white zoned area, white residential area, and a black residential area. They would write that into their zoning code. In the early 1900s, the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. So cities adopted single family only zoning in those white areas to do the same thing that racialized zoning did. By ensuring that only one house per lot could be built in those areas, it ensured the home prices remained high and only the most affluent families, which were the white families, could live in those areas. So as the first step towards diversifying those white segregated suburbs, we need to change the zoning to allow a more diverse housing type to be built in those areas with a broader range of affordability. Now, I understand that this is not easy. This kind of zoning change or proposals for multifamily housing, particularly in suburban communities, often met by a lot of resistance. So much resistance that those opposers have been given a name, NIMBYs, not in my backyard, people who say they agree with housing in general until there's a housing development or zoning change proposed for their own neighborhood, and then they vehemently oppose it. Well, I'm not going to say that it's easy to oppose those opposers, but it's not impossible. We believe that there's just as much support for these kinds of zoning changes in our communities as there is opposition. The support just hasn't been as vocal. And so we need to get out there and talk to our neighbors and show up at planning commission meetings and city council meetings when these kinds of changes are proposed to ensure that our elected officials hear from supporters of increasing housing supply, not only the opposers. I think a lot of elected officials want to do the right thing, which is adopt more housing friendly policies and approve more housing developments, but they need to hear from their constituents that they support it. And often they don't hear that from us. And so that's another thing we can do to help advance these kinds of solutions. So those are two main categories, increasing resources in segregated African-American communities and opening up segregated white communities. Then we also talk about a lot of strategies to increase home ownership for African-American families in all types of communities. We can do this through several ways, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with: down payment assistance programs, closing cost assistance programs, housing counseling, subsidies, credit scoring reform, a lot of ways to reduce the obstacles that African Americans face when trying to access home ownership. So one of those is down payment assistance, and we argue that those down payment assistance programs should be specifically targeted to African American homebuyers. And I understand that this might make some people uncomfortable. We have a Supreme Court who right now believes that we're a race blind, colorblind society. We shouldn't be adopting race specific programs or policies. But we believe that we need to have the courage to stand up to the Supreme Court, because these race specific policies are the only way to remedy what were race specific crimes of our government. You can't remedy a race specific crime with a race neutral policy. So that wealth gap that I mentioned that exists because of government policy, the only true way to narrow that wealth gap and to narrow the home ownership gap that results from that wealth gap is by providing down payment assistance targeted specifically to African American families who suffered the impacts of those past government policies. So we should have the courage to not defer to the Supreme Court or what we think the Supreme Court will say, and adopt these race specific programs. And we describe in Just Action some individuals who've created down payment assistance programs for Black and Hispanic homebuyers. They raise money through donations and provide pretty significant grants to these families to take the place of what would be intergenerational support, money from their parents or grandparents, but who these families are, denied that because of past government policies. So they're stepping in to provide that support. So we can support programs like that or start programs like that in our communities if they don't exist. There's also ways where public agencies or lending institutions can create race-specific benefits under the authority of federal law. This is called a special purpose credit program. It has been authorized by federal law since the 1970s. It allows financial or lending institutions or public agencies to implement race-specific financial programs and benefits if they can do a study to show that that racial group has been disadvantaged by the financial industry in the past. Not impossible to do that study. All of the history and details I've been laying out this morning would support a study like that and support justifying a race-specific program. These programs can be down payment assistance, closing cost assistance, favorable mortgages. So again, this has been allowed since the 1970s, but banks are only now starting to use this authority and adopt special purpose credit programs. So one thing we can do is advocate that our banks in our own communities start to adopt SPCPs, special purpose credit programs, to provide race-specific assistance to African American home buyers who've been shut out from home buying because of past government policy. Now, many banks have started these programs, but they're doing it on a neighborhood basis. So the benefits are you're eligible if you're buying a home in a census tract that's majority minority. Now, that is, I believe, the faulty, incorrect way of implementing the purpose of the special purpose credit programs, because by tying it to a neighborhood, you're either perpetuating the segregation of that neighborhood or helping to finance its gentrification. And what banks should instead be doing is making the benefit tied to the individual. So an African-American home buyer can use this benefit to buy a home in any neighborhood. And that's what we should be pressuring our local financial institutions to be adopting, that kind of beneficiary-specific, race-specific special purpose credit program. So banks can do that. We can also look to Washington State, which is the first state to have adopted a publicly run special purpose credit program. This was passed last April through the Washington Covenant Homeownership Act, which passed the first time it went through the state legislature in Washington after a bunch of volunteers around the state inventoried over 50,000 racially restrictive covenants around the state. So they showed how prevalent discrimination in housing was in the mid-20th century. And based on that history, the legislature adopted the Washington State Covenant Homeownership Act, which puts a $100 fee on every real estate transaction in the state going forward, which will then fund a down payment assistance program that will provide down payment assistance to the descendants of those people who were prohibited from home ownership through those restrictive covenants and other government policies. So this is an example of a publicly run program that where the remedy is specifically tied to the harm. Because that harm was race specific, the remedy is race specific. This will go a long way towards opening up home ownership access to buyers of color in Washington, where homes are very expensive and they don't have the money they need for a down payment because of all these government policies of the past. So we should all be following Washington's example and advocating for adopting our own special purpose credit programs in our own states and counties and cities. So one other, really quick before I stop for questions, one other example of an obstacle that African Americans face in a unique way that whites don't face in the same way towards accessing home ownership, and something we can do something about to lower that obstacle, that barrier. So as I've described, African Americans denied home ownership opportunities in obvious ways, like through those restrictive covenants. But they have also been denied home ownership opportunities in less obvious ways, less overt ways. One of those ways is through the credit scoring system. So we think of the credit scoring system as an objective system. It takes our financial history, feeds it into the system that then gives us a score. So if we've had, if we've defaulted on loans in the past, we'll have a lower score. That makes some sense. And if you have a high enough score, you can be eligible for a mortgage. And if it's even high enough, you can get a better interest rate on that mortgage. So we think it's objective. We think it's fair. It makes some kind of sense. You use your history to determine how good of a borrower a bank thinks you'll be in the future. Well, the problem is that it takes our financial history into the system, but it only factors in a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. Through no personal fault of their own, African Americans tend to live in communities with fewer bank branches. Without a bank branch in your community, you have less access to what are called traditional financial instruments: bank loans, credit cards, mortgages, car loans from a bank, etc. All of those traditional financial instruments feed into a credit scoring system. But if you don't have access to those because there's no bank branch in your neighborhood, you might use the kind of financial institution that is in your neighborhood, might be a payday lender. If you borrow money from a payday lender and pay it back in full, even with the exorbitant interest rates that those payday lenders charge, that financial history doesn't get fed into a credit scoring system because it's a non-traditional financial instrument. I think paying back a payday lender is just as good of an indication of how well you'll pay back a future loan, but it's not factored into the system. Similarly, if you've owned a home in the past and you've paid your mortgage on time, that financial history is fed into the credit scoring system. But if you're applying for a mortgage and you haven't owned a home in the past, you're a first-time home buyer. African Americans more likely to be a first-time home buyer than whites when they're applying for a mortgage. You don't have a mortgage history to feed into the credit scoring system, but you have a rental payment history. You maybe have paid your rent on time every month for your whole life, never missed a rent payment, never missed a utility bill payment. That kind of financial history also isn't factored into a credit score. This is why, on average, there are fewer African Americans are less likely to have a credit score at all when compared to whites, because they just don't have the kind of financial history that feeds into the system. Those that do have a credit score, African Americans far less likely to have a credit score high enough to qualify for a mortgage. Again, not because they're any less qualified as borrowers, but because of how the system is created. This is an example of a system that's racially neutral on its face and its intent. It doesn't have a racially discriminatory intent, but it has a racially discriminatory impact. And as such, we have an obligation to remedy that. Now, there's talk on the national level of changing the credit scoring system by factoring in rental payment history through the 3 credit scoring agencies. And there's some movement on that. There's some pilot programs, there's some opt-in programs. But in case you weren't aware, those changes resulted from 15 years of conversations on the national level. So that's a long time of waiting for change. As we're waiting for those, another 15 years to get those changes implemented all over the country, we can advocate with our local financial institutions, bank branches, credit unions, to start factoring rental payment history into their own credit scoring algorithms when they're assessing mortgage applicants. Bank branches, credit unions, have done this on a local level, and we describe some in Just Action that have done that, and many more are starting to. They often need some pressuring from local residents to get them on board with that change, because it's a little more work for them, but it's also good for the banks. It opens up a lot more lending potential, a bigger audience, a bigger market for their products by taking in a fuller financial history picture of their applicants. So that's another thing we could do on the local level to start to advocate for change that can reduce some of the barriers that African Americans face to getting into home ownership. I know I said I had one more thing, but I'm going to just tack on one more thing, because I know you all work with home ownership and helping folks get into home ownership, often first-time home buyers. So there's another issue that impacts the intergenerational wealth building potential of home ownership, particularly for homeowners of color, and that is a lack of estate plans. So most Americans don't have wills or estate plans, but over half of whites do, and less than a quarter of African American homeowners do. When a property owner dies without a will or estate plan, the property goes into probate and it becomes what's called an heir's property. That means it's owned in part by all of the heirs that the court decides are heirs to the original owner of that property or home. Now, some states have reformed these laws, but many haven't. Pennsylvania has not reformed these laws. So when a partial owner of an heir's property wants to sell their share, it might just be a 4% share of that property. They want to sell their share. It forces the sale of the entire property, including, if there's a family who's been living in that home for generations, but some distant relative sold their 4% share to an investor who then forces the sale of the entire property. That property is then sold at an auction. The buyer has to pay cash. So the family who's lived in that home for generations often can't buy the home at auction. Often the same investor that forced the sale then buys it at the auction and attains this land, this property that has been in a family, often an African-American family, for generations. So this is something we can reform on the state level to reform how heirs property works, so that you have to own, they usually change it to say you have to own a quarter of the share of the property to force a sale of the whole thing. And when the sale is forced, it has to be sold on market, so the family has a chance to get a mortgage and a loan to buy it instead of being sold at auction. So there's some ways to adjust how it's worked, but those are statewide policies. So until that is changed on the statewide level, there's a lot we can do with homeowners in our own communities to either help them get out of an heirs property designation if they live in a property that's considered an heirs property, Also, when you live in a property that's an heirs property designation, you're not on the deed to the home. You're not considered the legal owner. You can't get benefits that homeowners are entitled to, like disaster relief benefits or homestead exemptions for property taxes. You also can't get a refinance mortgage. So there's a lot of problems with this system. And so helping families who are in heirs property designation in their family home get out of that designation is important. But what's really even more important is to help every homeowner who we help get into home ownership, particularly those first-time home buyers of color, ensure that they have estate plans in place when they buy that home so that this doesn't happen, that the home doesn't go into probate, doesn't go into heirs property mode, and is handed down according to the wishes of that home buyer. I have heard and talked to a lot of programs that provide down payment assistance and home ownership counseling, that they partner with local law firms or legal aid societies to provide free legal counsel to their beneficiaries who are getting into home ownership to help them write an estate plan right when they get into that home to ensure that that's in place to avoid all of these problems. So I will stop now to have time for questions, but I know that was a lot of information. Those are just a few of the examples of what we can do locally to begin to challenge and redress segregation. There's a lot more in our book and a lot more in our Substack column that Jeremy mentioned at the beginning. It's justaction.substack.com. It's like a newsletter. We continue to write about these issues. What I hope from my talk today, and the book, if you have a chance to look at it, is that the takeaway is that sure, segregation is overwhelming. It feels intractable. It feels difficult to make any headway on challenging, but there's actually so much that we can do, so many actions and policy changes that we can take on that will go a long way towards undoing the segregation of our communities. It almost doesn't matter where we get started, just that we get started somewhere. So thank you so much for listening. And now I think looks like there's some questions in there. So let's see.
Yes. So we do have some questions. So back when you were talking about strategies to desegregate, the question is, do reparations have a place in these strategies?
Yes, I think so. So let's see. We don't use the term reparations in the book, Just Action, because reparations, at least when we were writing it, it has the connotation that we're repairing for slavery, which I think is important. But we're focused on repairing for the policies that happened post-slavery that were unconstitutional, in violation of the constitutional amendments that were adopted when slavery, was outlawed. And our government continued to violate those constitutional amendments. And so we talk about remedies for those constitutional violations that we think are important. Now, I think that since we wrote the book, the reparations conversation is sort of expanding. The term reparations is now including more, reparations for slavery, remedies for other government policies. And I think those are important. I do think that monetary reparations are important, but we focus on the policy changes and the remedies that can solve those government policies in housing and in creating segregation.
All right. Next question. Are there any resources available for researching racial covenants or deed restrictions on deeds? And then a follow-up. If people do want to remove them from their deeds, how should they go about it? What's the best way to go about it while maintaining that example of discrimination?
I don't think you can't remove them yourself or do anything about them yourself. It's like a property line in the deed of your home. You can't just change that if you want to. So local governments have to pass laws that allow you to either erase the covenant or put a repudiation on top of it. So it's something you'd have to advocate for on the county-wide level to get one of those policies in place that allows you to do something about the restrictive covenant. And I would, again, urge you to advocate for putting a repudiation on top of it rather than erasing it completely. And for researching racial covenants on your own home or in your own community, you would go to the county clerk's office and start looking through the deeds of homes. You could start by subdivisions were created, in the mid 20th century. And that's how people have started doing this. There's a website that has links to all of the communities that have these covenant research projects. I believe it's mappingcovenants.org. But again, on our Substack, justaction.substack.com, we have a column that's called Resources for Redressing Segregation. And that column is basically a bunch of links to organizations that can help you do all of these things I've been talking about. And one of those is the link to the covenant mapping projects.
Awesome. All right. So any insights from the evidence on the right way to implement inclusionary zoning policies, subsidy-based versus legal mandates? Are there any local factors that should tip the scale towards one direction or the other? Whether true or not, developers are quick to counter. So is there a way to argue against them that they're going to lose money by making these inclusionary zoning policies?
Yes. And I used to do this when I was a consultant. I did the economic studies that if a city or county is looking to adopt an inclusionary zoning ordinance, they should do an economic study to show what the profit margin is for building homes in their community and how that will be affected by providing or by putting an inclusionary requirement on it. Because it's true, if the requirement is too large, where the housing is no longer profitable, developers won't build. So you want to set that amount, the percent of inclusionary units, to not tip them over towards being unprofitable. Now, developers will always say that that will happen no matter what percentage inclusionary requirement you're suggesting. So that's why having this study where you can counter them and say, no, actually, we can see a 10% requirement would still allow, this level of profitability. 15% wouldn't, but that's why we're advocating 10%. So having the actual numbers, which these economic studies often get the cost numbers from the developers themselves. So it's their own numbers, their own pro formas that you can use to counter their own arguments. And that's essential, for passing a policy at all, because you do want to make sure that it's not stopping all development completely and that it still, you can also factor in the different incentives that a city or county can provide that go along with the inclusionary requirement. Sometimes they provide a density bonus, so a developer can build a larger development if they have a certain percentage of affordable units. Those are all good. I think those incentives are often very important to help make it profitable and make it so that new housing is built and those affordable units are produced. There's other factors that are loopholes that are often built into these policies that I think should be avoided, like allowing developers to pay a fee instead of building the units in their own development. That doesn't meet the goal of producing new affordable units, and it doesn't meet the goal of producing affordable units in a market rate building. Sometimes they allow developers to build the affordable units off-site. That's just, again, creating segregation between those buildings. So requiring the developments be built on-site, integrated with the market rate units, I think is essential, and not allowing those like loopholes for developers to get out of creating the integrated buildings that the policy can create.
Awesome. Thank you. So you mentioned giving priority to Black residents for new housing development. But what about in areas that aren't doing a lot of new building, but are having a lot of home ownership turnover? What can we do to protect those homes for Black residents or more broadly, residents of color?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That is an issue everywhere. And there's some things we can do to preserve home ownership. There's let's see, one of the issues is property taxes. So in areas with rising home values, property taxes are rising. Homeowners of color, more often lower income on fixed incomes, they can't keep up with those rising property taxes. Furthermore, all across the country and communities all over the country, homeowners in areas, neighborhoods where, communities of color homeowners of color, they pay higher than their fair share of property taxes. They pay higher property taxes relative to the value of their home than white homeowners in the same county. This is true all over the country. On average, Black homeowners pay 10 to 13% more in property taxes relative to the value of their homes than white homeowners. So this is something that we should address on the countywide level to address this disparity in property tax assessments, ensure that our county tax assessors are doing the reason why that disparity exists is because assessments aren't done very accurately or reassessments aren't done very frequently. And when you're not assessing the value of the home correctly and you apply a property tax rate to an incorrect home assessed value, where in white communities it's usually underassessed home values, they according to the property tax system, home values are actually lower than the true market value. And in African American communities, the assessed values are often higher than their true market value. So if your assessed value of your home is incorrect, you're paying the incorrect share of property taxes. Homeowners of color overpaying in property taxes all over the country. So we can address that system to help homeowners. That's one way those homeowners are forced out of home ownership as they fall behind on property taxes and end up losing their home through a tax lien foreclosure process. So we can help make the tax system more fair overall to ensure that African American and homeowners of color aren't overpaying in property taxes to begin with. And then we can address what happens when they fall behind on property taxes, which is help them access the benefits and deferments and other sort of property tax relief that they're eligible for, help them know when they're behind on property taxes, help advocate that your city or county doesn't sell those tax debts to investors who then can foreclose on the home, but instead work with the homeowners to stay in their home and not lose their home through that process. That's one example. There's a lot more. Again, I know we're running out of time,
Yeah,
but homeownership preservation is just as important as homeownership access.
So we are at time. We have one more question. So what are the best ways to advocate for credit score reform, getting those rental payments to count towards someone's credit score?
Yeah, what was that?
Especially at the local level.
I think starting by, getting a group together who is ready to advocate for this issue, and then meeting with local bank branch managers and talk to them about what it would take for them to adjust their credit scoring algorithm, how they would collect that information. You can look at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition is an organization that helps community groups organize and advocate for bank reform. You can help show how many more borrowers this bank will have access to if they reform their credit scoring system. And that is very convincing to banks. It's good for them and it's good for the community. So you can find examples of banks that have done that and how much it has opened up their market to new borrowers. So that's how I would start.
All right. Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we have time for. Ms. Rothstein, thank you for being here and giving this talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to all these the local areas. It's really, really helpful to the local organizations to hear that broader perspective and nail it down to the local level. If you guys are interested, make sure you do pick up her book, Just Action. We do have a few copies here at our office, 10-foot, if you wanted to come by and pick one up. Again, thank everybody for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.